Now that we've spent a little bit of time talking about the basics, the fundamentals of object-oriented programming, I wanted to actually go into an example where we could work on implementing some objects in a more realistic setting. So of course, since our colors example has been the example that we've been working on up until this point, it just makes sense that we turn our eyes back towards it again and discuss maybe upgrading it to a object-oriented way of working. Implementing objects here in our color examples is not necessarily going to be a really quick and simple thing. It could be considerably complex, and in doing this, I think it might be important for us to actually talk about whether it would be worth the effort and what our goals might be if we did want to switch it over to an object-oriented way of working. So the basic story is, the way I look at my application, it's essentially made up of three different parts. There's the part of the application that I actually interact with. Basically, what URLs can I call? What parameters can I pass to those URLs? How does the application then respond when I actually do communicate with it in one of those ways? Second part is how does the application actually look when I do interact with it in some way, when I do request a URL with a particular parameter? How is the response that's actually sent back to me formatted? How does it appear? What format is it in? Is it HTML or some other type of data? The third part is how does the application actually manage my data? There's lots of different ways that the application could potentially store and work with whatever data it needs to work with. In this case, of course, we're talking about our color data, but in what ways does the application then actually handle the data? These are essentially three separate and potentially distinct parts of this application, how it manages the data, how it interacts with the user, and its actual appearance. The way I actually have the application set up right now, however, is that two of these parts are actually blended together. The way I have it set up right now is the appearance of the application is actually a separate piece, but right now, how the application manages the data and how I interact with the application are actually combined together into a single part. Here, if we take a look at some of our pages, you might remember what we're talking about. Here's my page called index.php, and what this page essentially does is it loads the colors. When it loads the colors there, what it's actually doing is it is interacting directly with the data. This load color function that I've defined is a function that's being called, and that function is very, very specific to exactly how the colors are stored. This function right now is very specific to the fact that those colors are stored in a text file. It specifically loads the color data from a text file, converts that data from the text file into a two-dimensional array, which is then returned. The other part that's actually blended here that's not quite so obvious is the fact that the index.php page is a page that I actually call. So this is a reachable part of my application through a URL. I can activate this particular part of my application by requesting a specific page, index.php. So the same page that I'm actually requesting is also intimately tied to how the data itself is actually stored. That could be a little bit of a problem on its own, because that means that if I, for example, wanted to change how the colors were actually stored, if I wanted to switch over to having the colors stored in a database, for example, it would mean that I would actually have to change this page, and that's something that is potentially less than desirable. Because if I have to change this page, that most likely means that if I wanted to change how my colors were loaded, I would have to change every page, which is something I would actually prefer to get away from. So with that, you can see that two of those three parts that I specified are pretty closely tied together. The fact that this is a page that I call and this page is directly involved in how the data is loaded. The third part, how the application looks, that part I've actually already sort of spun off onto its own when I switched over to this templatized way of displaying my pages, where a page I request, like index.php for example, requests a template page. And that template page then lays down the foundation for how the response is going to be formatted, and then on its own figures out what data to actually fill into that particular response, including the format of that data. Here, for example, is my page called index.view.php. That part is fundamentally separate from what's actually going on in the index.php itself. The index.php page is requested, it's involved in loading the colors, but then it essentially hands off the responsibility for deciding how to put that response together over here to this page that currently I have called template. It's the template page over there that then decides how to actually show the response. It takes the data that I've required and then integrates that data into the proper response, which is what then gets sent back to the user. So while my application is made up of 3 different parts, currently, like I said, 2 of those parts are really the same. They're kind of stuck together. So I have my viewing of the data separate, but interacting with the data, the pages that I request essentially, the parameters that I pass, is all very, very much tied up in how the data itself is actually stored. An even better example of that might be if we look at something like my new page. The new page for colors, it's much more obvious that the requesting, the handling of parameters, and the working with data is all very directly tied together. On the new page, the parts that are in here that actually work directly with the data are quite obvious. Here you see we're actually opening a file, we're writing to a file. Here's an fwrite statement. So we're very much working directly with the data and how that data is stored here in this page. But we're also interacting with the fact that data is being requested. We're validating data, we're pulling data out of an array. Everything's all sort of mashed together. That can potentially, like I mentioned before, end up causing me some problems in the long run, because what if, for example, I wanted to change how the data was actually stored? If I wanted to change over to using a database instead of a file, I'm going to have to take both of these parts and rewrite them all. If I was able to actually split all 3 of these parts up so that they were more separate and distinct, more encapsulated from one another, it would potentially make for an application that was much more flexible, an application where I could more easily swap in and out different aspects of it. For example, if those 2 parts weren't connected as intimately as they are right now, swapping out a version of the application that manages the data in a flat file with one that instead manages the data in a database would be a much easier thing. I could change out that one component, if you want to think of it that way, and the rest of the application could go on completely unchanged. I already have that same basic capability with the view. If I should decide that I want to change the way that the responses look, all I have to do is go over to that template page and write a little bit of code in it to have it decide how to change the view based on what circumstances and then return that different representation of the data. I could do that right now without having to change anything about how the data is stored or the actual URLs or parameters that I call or pass. So there is definitely an advantage in this, and that's where I see our objects potentially playing a role. What I imagine we can do with our objects is, what if we got our objects to be able to represent our data? Our data in this case, of course, is data about our colors. So what I'm talking about is probably something like a color class. If we could take all of the management of the color data and put it into a color class, which could give us color objects, and we could encapsulate those objects, essentially set it up so that what happened inside those objects had no effect on the outside world, and things on the outside of those objects didn't affect what went on inside of them, then that would put me in a situation where right now I could have my color class potentially storing all my color data, working with all my color data in a file. But later, if I wanted to switch over to having all of my color data instead in a database, all it would require is changing the color class. Nothing would have to be changed about any other part of my application. So that is the essential goal that I would be looking towards in changing my color example over to be object-oriented. What I would be shooting for is the encapsulation of the work that's done with the actual data itself, splitting the actual data work off from the interactions with the user and the actual appearance of the application. Now, this particular idea, this pattern of setting up an application, is certainly not something that I dreamed up. This is a very old pattern in programming that's been around for quite a while. In this pattern, the way these 3 parts of the application are typically referred to is the part that actually deals with the data is usually referred to as the model. The part that the user interacts with is usually called the controller, and the part that actually determines how the application looks is usually called the view. So what we're talking about here is a pattern where an application is split up into 3 parts called model, controller, and view. Usually when people refer to this, they refer to it as MVC, model, view, controller. So the same basic idea, just with everything in a slightly different order than what I had. So MVC, model, view, controller. like I said, it's not my idea. You can go out and do a Google search for MVC or Model View Controller, and you'll come back with hundreds and thousands and millions of resources referring to MVC. It's a very well-known pattern that's been used by a lot of people a lot of different times. And it's essentially what I described to you. You can certainly go out on the web and read more about it. As a matter of fact, I would definitely encourage you to do so. But it's all about essentially creating these modular applications made up of these three different layers, these three different fundamental parts, which then make it easier to be able to swap parts in and out in order to be able to make our programs more modular, more upgradable, easier to debug. There's just lots and lots of wonderful advantages about it. So that's what we would be shooting for here in our colors example.